I've lived in the Yukon Territory for 8 years now, alone in a cabin built by my grandfather. It's the kind of place where silence has weight, and winter is more than a season, it's a test. That January, the cold came early and harder than I'd ever felt it, 48 degrees Celsius and still falling. The kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it buries. The snow was knee-deep when I first saw her, a silhouette just beyond the tree line, lean, ragged, and moving with purpose. Not a wolf, not a fox, a bobcat with 3 smaller shadows trailing behind. Cubs, thin, trembling things, barely able to keep pace. I should have bolted the door. A wild animal in that state? Desperate, dangerous. But something in her eyes, something ancient, worn down by the cold and the fear, made me freeze. She looked straight at me and then stepped toward the cabin. I stood at the edge of the doorway, the ironwood frame creaking under the strain of cold, as if the house itself was groaning with the weight of the storm. The air bit through the seams of my coat and settled into my bones with a silence that felt older than the forest. The mother bobcat didn't make a sound. She only stared, that feral yellow gaze locked on mine, unblinking. Her coat was thin in places, ragged with frost, ribs faintly visible beneath the thick winter pelt that should have been fuller by now. Behind her, 3 cubs pressed themselves together into the snow, barely more than living shadows trembling from the cold, their paws lifted awkwardly like the ground itself stung. They shouldn't have been here. Bobcats don't seek humans, not unless something's gone wrong. But here they were, crossing the invisible line between wild instinct and impossible trust, and it was clear they had nowhere else to go. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, orange coals flickering beneath logs I'd been rationing all week. The woodpile was running short, and the next supply run was days away, weather permitting. I knew that letting them in would mean chaos, maybe danger, but leaving them out there wasn't a decision I could live with. I pulled the door wider and stepped aside. For a moment, no one moved. The wind screamed over the roof, rattling ice off the edge of the eaves. Then, slowly, like she was measuring every ounce of risk, the mother bobcat stepped forward. Her body passed mine within arm's reach, and the scent that hit me was a pungent mix of pine sap, blood, and cold earth. One by one, the cubs followed, their eyes wide and hesitant, their movements uneven. The smallest one, white-pawed and weak-legged, stumbled over the threshold. I bent down instinctively and reached out a hand, expecting a hiss or a bite, but instead it collapsed against my fingers, too exhausted to resist. The cabin, small as it was, suddenly felt like a world compressed into a box of breath and heat. I kept low, speaking softly, watching as the mother paced in cautious circles around the rug near the stove. She didn't growl, she didn't challenge me. She just watched. Her body, tense and ready, stood guard while the cubs curled into the warmth radiating from the hearthstone. I pulled a blanket from the couch and laid it nearby. The biggest cub, a smoky-furred one with a split ear, crawled onto it immediately. The smallest still hadn't moved. I could hear its breathing, wet, shallow, irregular. My fingers found the canteen on the table and soaked a cloth in warm water. As I knelt beside it and dabbed the melting ice from its nose and paws, a vibrating growl came from behind me. I turned. The mother stood a foot away, teeth bared, ears flat. But her eyes were not fury. They were fear, and they were pleading. The first night blurred into a half-conscious vigil, the kind you fall into when you know the world around you isn't just watching, it's waiting. I stayed in the old rocking chair beside the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket that still smelled faintly of the cedar chest it had been stored in. The mother bobcat barely moved, keeping herself between me and her cubs with a stillness that made time feel fragile. Every shift I made, each time I reached for more wood or stirred the fire, her eyes followed, taut with suspicion. But she didn't leave. She didn't lash out. That unspoken pact between us was holding, for now. By morning, the cold outside had turned the windows into frosted glass paintings, delicate spirals and icy feathers tracing every edge. Inside, the air was warm enough for breath to vanish before reaching your nose. The cubs had curled tighter during the night, forming a mound of fur and bones so fragile it almost didn't seem alive. The smallest, the one with the white paws, Snow, I had started calling him, was still weak. I dipped a finger into the rehydrated powdered goat milk I used for emergencies and gently touched it to his lips. Nothing. I tried again, murmuring nonsense, the way one speaks to a child, not out of logic, but hope. This time his mouth twitched. He licked. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The mother came closer. I felt her presence more than I saw it, the weight of her silence pressing in on me. She could have swatted the cup from my hand, could have taken the cub and dragged him away. But instead, she lowered her head and sniffed at the milk-soaked cloth, then, slowly, sat. Not relaxed. But not in protest either. It was, in its own wild way, permission. Over the next 2 days, the cabin began to change. My space, once neat, quiet, predictable, became a terrain of compromise. My boots got knocked over by exploring paws. A cup shattered when Ash leapt onto the table. Flint found the couch and made it his kingdom, swatting my hand each time I dared reach for the remote. I laughed once, really laughed, when I caught him dragging a mitten across the floor like it was prey. It had been years since I'd made that sound in earnest. But even in those moments of absurd calm, I could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. Not everyone was built for this kind of coexistence. The mother bobcat still didn't sleep. At least not that I ever saw. She perched by the door during the night, staring into the wind-churned dark beyond the glass, muscles always taut, as though a lifetime in the wild wouldn't let her fully believe in the warmth she'd found. I didn't blame her. Part of me felt the same. But the real challenge wasn't whether she could adapt to me. It was whether I could continue adapting to them. It was the 5th morning since they'd arrived when I noticed something wasn't right. The cabin, once filled with the gentle shuffle of tiny paws and the low rustle of fur against worn wool blankets, had gone quiet, unnaturally so. I stood from the table, coffee mug forgotten in my hand, and scanned the room. Flint and Ash were curled up near the stove, twitching in sleep. The mother sat by the window, her posture alert but unusually still. Snow was missing. I called out instinctively, though I knew none of them understood my words. Still, the tone, urgent, rising, was met with a reaction. The mother turned to me, then to the narrow hallway leading to the back pantry. I followed her gaze, the boards creaking beneath my socks. The door to the pantry was slightly ajar, swaying gently from the draft I'd meant to fix weeks ago. I pushed it open slowly. The faint scent of cedar and preserved fruit gave way to something sharper, something bitter and organic. In the corner, beneath a hanging bundle of dried herbs, lay Snow. His body was curled tight, but something was wrong. His breathing, shallow and irregular just days ago, was now almost undetectable. His eyes were barely open, and one paw twitched without rhythm. I knelt down, the cold from the floor soaking through my jeans. A soft whimper escaped him, barely audible. The mother bobcat appeared behind me, her body rigid, her breathing quick and shallow. I reached out and gently touched Snow's side. Heat. Feverish. My fingers trailed over his fur and stopped on a swollen patch along his ribs, an abscess. I hadn't noticed it before, likely hidden beneath his coat when he arrived. Infection. Deep and fast-moving. I backed out of the pantry and scanned the shelves. I had basic supplies, antibiotic salve, sterilized gauze, a syringe kit I'd used once when I found a frostbitten lynx with a broken paw. But this was different. This was a cub, barely clinging to life. I wasn't a vet. I wasn't trained for this. The decision I made next wasn't one of logic, and it wasn't easy. I climbed up the narrow ladder into the loft and dragged out the black case I hadn't opened in over 3 years. My emergency satellite phone. It had dust on the keypad, and the battery was nearly dead. I plugged it in and waited, heart pounding. When the signal blinked on, I hesitated, thumb hovering over the dial. Calling for help meant breaking the barrier. Involving the outside world meant explaining why there were wild animals in my home, why I'd allowed them to stay. It meant scrutiny, questions, perhaps even removal. But watching Snow tremble alone in the pantry, knowing he might not survive the night, left no space for pride or secrecy. I dialed Marlene. The line crackled before her voice came through, groggy but unmistakable. "Jonas, what's wrong?" I hadn't heard Marlene's voice in over a year. Even through the distortion, it still carried that low, steady tone that used to talk me down from cliffs, real and imagined. I told her everything, not all at once, not cleanly, but in that rushed, fragmented way people do when their world is spinning. About the mother bobcat, the cubs, the cold, the sudden appearance. About Snow. She didn't interrupt, just listened. "I'm coming," she said, once I finally stopped. "I'll call Callum, get the vet kit. We'll take the Skidoo trail, 12 hours, tops." She didn't ask me why I'd kept them. Didn't shame me for letting wild animals live in my house. That silence, filled with trust, hit harder than any rebuke could have. I returned to the pantry to find the mother curled protectively around Snow, licking his head with a soft rhythm, as if trying to keep him rooted to this world through touch alone. I approached slowly, gauze and antibiotic cream in hand, and knelt beside them. She didn't move, but her ears tilted back as I came close. I whispered as I worked, not because she needed the words, but because I did. "He's strong, you know, stronger than he looks." Ash and Flint, sensing the shift in the cabin's energy, grew restless. Ash started pacing the room, occasionally mewing in a high, frustrated pitch. Flint climbed onto the windowsill, watching the snow fall in slow, relentless sheets, tail flicking like a fuse. Even the fire burned quieter, as if the whole space was holding its breath. The hours crawled. I forced fluids into Snow's mouth every hour, using a dropper from my kit. He fought it at first, weak but stubborn, his tiny body twitching beneath the blanket. Then, slowly, he began to accept it. By late evening, the fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't gotten worse either, and that somehow felt like a win. I caught myself speaking to them more, not just out loud, but conversationally, like they were guests, like they might answer if they chose to. I told them about the last time it got this cold, when the river cracked in half and the aurora lit the sky for 6 nights straight. I told them about the fox who used to steal my bait fish right off the hook. I told them about the silence and how I thought I loved it, until they showed up and broke it in the gentlest way possible. That night, just before Marlene and Callum were expected, I looked at the mother bobcat and said, "I didn't ask for this." She blinked, a slow, deliberate blink that felt less like agreement and more like understanding. They arrived just after nightfall, their snowmobiles cutting through the silence with a mechanical growl that sent all 3 cubs scuttling under the table. Even Elsa, the mother, though I'd only just started calling her that in my head, rose like a drawn bow. Her muscles locked tight, her head low, ears pinned flat. I stood between her and the door just as the latch clicked. "It's okay," I said, uncertain who I was speaking to. Marlene entered first, face flushed from cold, heavy with the smell of gasoline and pine. Callum followed, his parka streaked with snow, boots thudding against the cabin floor like punctuation marks. Their eyes scanned the room with visible disbelief, then concern. Marlene dropped her bag and crouched near the fire, eyes softening as they caught sight of Snow. "God, Jonas, they're just babies." She didn't ask for an explanation. She only reached for her vet kit. Callum, though, wasn't as gentle. "You know this isn't legal, right?" His voice wasn't angry, but the weight of it hung in the air like fog. Wildlife in a home, even injured, it's a protected species violation. If someone else had reported this. "No one else did," I cut in. "You're the only ones who know, and I wasn't about to let them die in 48. He looked at me for a long moment before sighing and rubbing his face with a gloved hand. "I didn't say I'd report it, just that you're walking a line." Snow whimpered as Marlene administered fluids through a needle, his tiny body flinching but not resisting. Ash hissed from under the table. Flint darted out and leapt onto the back of the couch, eyes burning like 2 flames in the low firelight. Elsa let out a low, warning growl, not to attack, but to remind everyone that she was still in charge of the room. It was then Marlene asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What happens after this, Jonas? When Snow's better? When the weather breaks?" I had no answer. That night, they stayed. I insisted, but I think they planned to anyway. Marlene slept on the couch, her arm resting near the blanket nest the cubs had claimed. Callum sat up near the woodpile, one eye always open, the other half closed with unease. It was strange watching them navigate my life, my space. Stranger still, watching how quickly they bent around the bobcats, even without admitting it. Marlene spoon-fed Snow through the night, while Ash curled against her leg like he'd always belonged there. And despite all his talk, I caught Callum whispering to Flint when he thought no one was watching. The storm outside deepened, but inside, something had shifted. We weren't just sheltering animals anymore, we were caught in something far messier. The law, the logistics, the inevitable "what now" that waited just outside the cabin door All of it began to creep in like the cold wind through a cracked window frame. By the third morning, the wind had calmed, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had grown heavy in its own way. The fire still burned, the cubs still breathed, Snow a little stronger now, his fever starting to break. But it was the quiet between moments that struck deepest. The pauses in conversation, the unspoken questions that lingered in Marlene's glances and Callum's sidelong stares. No one said it outright, but we were all thinking the same thing. What now? Marlene sat on the floor with Snow on her lap, his head rising and falling with each soft breath. She stroked his back, her voice barely a whisper. "You know they can't stay, right?" Her words were gentle, as if she already knew how they'd land. I didn't respond immediately. My hands were busy chopping wood at the edge of the hearth, but my mind was 1,000 miles away, pacing like Elsa by the window. "They came here," I finally said. "She brought them, not by accident." "She brought them because she was out of options," she replied. "And you gave her one, but now the cold is breaking and she's going to need more than warmth. She'll need space, territory, a future. This isn't her world, Jonas." I looked at Elsa, still a sentinel at the window. Her eyes followed the tree line like she was memorizing every branch, as if any moment now she might be forced to make a choice. Her body was still strong, though the burden of watching over her cubs had hollowed her in small ways, tightness in the shoulders, the constant flicking alertness of her ears. She was trying, so was I, but we were both running out of time. Callum stirred from the table, sipping coffee like it was armor. "You keep them too long, they'll lose their edge. Forget how to hunt, how to track. You'll be raising pets, not predators." I shot him a look. "And letting them go too soon, that's a death sentence. They survived this long because she taught them how. Let her keep teaching." And there it was, the line drawn in frost and fire between protection and possession. I wasn't ready to admit what I already knew. That part of me didn't want to let them go. That I'd started dreaming of mornings where Ash would race across the floor like a comet, where Flint would blink at me from the windowsill like he knew more than he let on. That maybe, just maybe, I needed them as much as they'd needed me. The mother stood and walked over to me then, her gaze level, as if she could read every thought behind my silence. She didn't growl, didn't pace. She just looked, long, patient, ancient. And I realized the choice wasn't only mine. That evening, something changed in the air, not the kind you can measure with thermometers or barometers, but something more primal, more instinctive. It started as a scent on the wind, barely noticeable beneath the comforting odors of burning pine, boiled oats, and the coppery warmth of animal fur, but enough to make Elsa freeze near the back door. Her ears stiffened first, swiveling like antennae pulled toward a frequency I couldn't hear. Then her body followed, low and silent, crouching along the floorboards as if every creak might give away a secret. She stared at the door, not just wary, ready. I stepped to the window, pulling the heavy thermal curtain aside with 2 fingers. The sky had turned the color of steel, dusk arriving with the slow crawl of twilight that winter liked to drag across this part of the world. Shadows pooled beneath the trees, long and broken, stretching out like fingers across the snow. But it wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't see that made my chest tighten. The birds, even the crows that scavenged the nearby ridgeline, had gone silent. The woods, always alive with some whisper, had settled into an eerie hush. Nature was holding its breath again, and then the tracks appeared. Not paw prints, boots, fresh ones. They led up from the northern edge of the slope, following no clear path, cutting across the frozen creek and winding through the alder brush like someone was trying not to be seen. Deep, deliberate, heavy. Not from Marlene, not from Callum. Someone else. Elsa growled, deep and guttural. Her body blocked the cubs, pressing them backward with the bulk of her frame. Ash hissed and tried to dart, but she snagged him by the scruff before he could vanish under the cot. Flint, for once, froze completely, and Snow, still too weak to do more than lift his head, let out a soft, confused cry. I grabbed my coat and rifle, an old .308 that hadn't fired in years, but still held weight in my hands like it remembered its purpose. I stepped outside, the cold like a slap across the face, sharp enough to sting even beneath wool and canvas. My breath fogged before me, and I followed the tracks as far as I dared without losing sight of the cabin. There, near the bend in the creek, was a flash of orange, a torn scrap of a jacket maybe, caught on the bark of a leaning birch, and nearby something darker, a dugout, shallow, covered in brush. Someone had been living rough out here, watching, maybe longer than I wanted to think about. A tangle of bones in the snow told part of the story. Rabbit, maybe, or something smaller. Nearby, a spent match, still half warm in the ash. When I returned to the cabin, Elsa hadn't moved from the door. She watched me, not with fear but recognition. She had known before I had. Something was out there, something not of the wild, but not quite of the civilized world either. A presence neither of us could name, but both understood in our bones. By the time morning broke, casting pale gold through the rimed windows, the snow had stopped. The forest stood like a breath held too long, still aching, frozen in mid-thought. The tracks were already beginning to soften beneath fresh powder, but the unease remained, coiled like smoke in the spaces between silence. I hadn't slept. Neither had Elsa. She kept her post by the door, eyes fluttering closed for only seconds at a time before jerking open again, her body always between the cubs and the threshold. Flint was the first to move, stretching lazily on the back of the couch with a yawn that looked almost domestic. Then Ash, skittering across the floor like he'd forgotten the world beyond the walls. And finally, Snow, still frail, still thin, but with the smallest fire returning to his gaze. Marlene rose and moved to them with a grace I hadn't seen in her for years. She had always been the one who could quiet things, me, mostly. Now she did it with a whisper, a hand trailing gently over fur as she whispered morning greetings like a lullaby. "Ash," she said, brushing a smudge of soot from his back, "you're trouble." And to Flint, "You still own this couch, huh?" Even Callum, who had spent the night on edge near the window with a mug of bitter coffee cooling beside him, couldn't hide the crack in his facade when Snow climbed clumsily into his lap and refused to budge. "Well," he muttered, "guess I'm not moving for a while." But his hand stayed there, unmoving, resting over Snow's tiny spine as though afraid to break something sacred. Something had changed. Not just in the cats, or even in me, but in all of us. The fear had quieted, replaced by a delicate kind of harmony, an awareness of shared responsibility that bound us tighter than words could. We were no longer caretakers of wild creatures. We were participants in something ancient, something instinctual that didn't need explaining. There was an understanding between us and them, forged not by choice, but by necessity. But none of it answered the question that still hung in the air. What happened next? I stepped outside again after breakfast, following the trail I'd found the night before. I didn't go far, but far enough to confirm what I had hoped not to. Whoever had been out there was gone, but not far. The makeshift camp had been stripped clean. No prints leading away. No sign of panic, just absence, intentional, silent. When I returned, Elsa met me with a stare that no longer felt like warning. It felt like trust. Maybe fragile, maybe fleeting, but real. I sat on the floor, and for the first time since they arrived, she crossed the room toward me. The cubs followed without question, curling around my legs like I had been part of their story all along. In that moment, the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like something else entirely. Not home, not wilderness, but a space between. A place none of us had planned to find, yet all of us now needed. The cabin, for all its warmth, had become too small for the silence inside it. It pressed in from the corners, filled the spaces between glances, lingered even in the softest moments, like when Ash leapt into Marlene's lap and purred so deeply it resonated through the soles of her boots. Or when Callum paused mid-step every time he walked past Snow, lowering his voice instinctively, like one wrong sound might break him. But these quiet bonds, these tiny, unspoken rituals we'd built together, none of them changed the truth clawing at the edges of it all. They couldn't stay. It came up first during breakfast, where the clink of spoons and mugs barely masked the tension in the room. Marlene was the one who spoke, softly, without accusation, but the words dropped like stone. "We need to talk about reintroduction." My grip on the coffee pot tightened. Callum cleared his throat and pushed his plate aside. "You know they won't be safe if someone else finds them here. People don't understand. They see wild animals in a house and assume threat, or crime. The law doesn't bend for good intentions." "They're not ready," I said, voice low but certain. Snow's still weak, and the others, they're changing. You can see it. They're trusting us. That's the problem, Marlene said. Not angry, just honest. They're starting to think we're part of their world. Elsa was lying near the fire, her breath steady, her eyes half-lidded but watching us. Always watching, as if she understood more than she let on. Her ears twitched at the rise in voices. She didn't move, but I saw the tension ripple through her muscles like a wave beneath still water. She knew the mood had shifted. I stood, unable to keep sitting still in the weight of that moment. And if we release them now, in the cold, when prey is scarce and Snow can barely stand on his own, if we send them out there and they don't come back, then it's their choice, Callum interrupted. Not ours. That's what matters. You gave them a fighting chance, Jonas. You did more than most would. But if you keep them, you're the one taking choice away. I stepped outside to breathe. The cold didn't sting like it had. The air had softened with the coming thaw, though the snow still blanketed the trees like time frozen in mid-step. The forest was waiting. It always was. And for the first time, I didn't know if I could meet its gaze. Inside, Elsa stood. The cubs stirred beside her as if responding to some silent call. She padded to the window and stared out with a calm that felt ancient. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. She was ready. I wasn't. The next day arrived with a sun that barely made it past the treetops, its light thin and watery as it filtered through the frost-streaked windows. There was no warmth in it, just a glow that hinted at time passing whether we were ready or not. The cabin was unnaturally still. The fire had burned low, and no one rushed to stoke it. The bobcats were quiet, too quiet. Even Ash, who had been a storm of motion since the moment his paws first hit the rug, now sat pressed beside Elsa, watching us with something that looked eerily like expectation. Marlene was packing, quietly, methodically. She moved through the cabin with a weight in her movements, folding clothes and sealing medical supplies into a waterproof bag. Her eyes didn't meet mine, but I could feel the goodbye she was building with every zip, every fold. I hovered near the window, pretending to look out, but really, I was watching my reflection in the glass. My face looked older than it had a week ago, tired in ways I hadn't known I still carried. Behind me, Callum leaned on the edge of the table, his voice low. "There's talk in Dawson," he said. "Hunters spotted a bobcat near the ridge a few days back. Big one. Word got around. Someone saw tracks near your land, same day we arrived. Rumors spread fast out here." I turned to face him slowly. "What kind of rumors? That you're keeping wild animals. That you're unwell, alone too long, getting strange." I let out a sharp breath that was almost a laugh. "I've always been strange, just never mattered before." He didn't smile. "It matters now." I looked at Elsa. She was staring out the same window I'd just turned from. Maybe she had always known this would be temporary. Maybe wild things never let themselves forget. The cubs were watching her, waiting, I realized, for her decision. They were strong now. Even Snow, though smaller than the others, was standing on his own, walking short circles, testing his legs like someone who had only just remembered how to move. I turned to Marlene. "If I release them, they might die." She met my eyes finally. "If you keep them, they'll forget who they are." That line stayed with me even after the conversation ended, even after she and Callum loaded the last of their gear onto the skidoo and stood at the door, waiting for me to say the words we all feared. She didn't pressure me again. She just placed a hand on my arm. "You gave them a bridge, Jonas, but you're not the other side of it." And then they were gone. The cabin felt heavier in their absence. Elsa shifted her stance and for the first time came to me on her own. She pressed her head gently against my leg, held it there, then stepped away. The cubs followed. Not out the door, not yet, but to the threshold. Waiting. The snow had softened into a damp hush, the kind of quiet that only comes after the storm has spent itself, leaving the world hushed and hollow. It wasn't cold anymore, at least not like before. The air still bit, but it no longer threatened to kill. It simply reminded you that winter never truly leaves up here. It only sleeps, waiting. The path from the cabin door into the trees had become visible again, the wind revealing patches of hard-packed snow beneath the crust. A trail. An invitation. I stood just inside the door, boots on, rifle strapped to my shoulder, not for protection, but out of ritual. The cubs were restless. They circled, darted, paused, Ash led as he always did, tail high and twitching. Flint followed more cautiously, his eyes flicking from me to the window and back again. Snow lingered near the fire, unsure. And Elsa, she was already at the door. She turned and looked at me, not with fear, not even with longing, just stillness, a kind of waiting I could feel in the center of my chest. It wasn't a question, it was the final offering of trust. She wouldn't go unless I let her. But I also knew she wouldn't stay much longer, even if I asked. I crouched beside Snow and ran a hand gently over his back, my fingers pausing at the ridge of his spine. He flinched, then leaned in. He would survive, not because of me, because he had his mother, because he had siblings, because deep inside, even after all this warmth, all this human quiet, his heart still beat with the rhythm of the wild. The door was open now, just enough to let in a breath of wind, just enough to frame the path beyond. Trees stood like old sentinels, unmoving, but somehow watchful. The world outside didn't care that I had loved them. It didn't care that I had memorized the sound of their steps or given them names they never asked for. It only offered space, distance, truth. I called Snow's name one last time, not loudly, not like a command, just enough for him to hear it and decide what it meant. Elsa stepped outside. Ash bounded after her without hesitation, a flicker of muscle and curiosity. Flint hesitated, always the thinker, and then followed with one backward glance that nearly broke me. Snow lingered. I didn't move, didn't speak, just knelt by the open door and let the air wrap around us like a second skin. After a long, shivering pause, he stood, wobbled, then walked past me, so close his tail brushed my leg. I didn't reach out, I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But some goodbyes aren't made for touch, some are made in silence. And so I watched them vanish into the woods, their bodies slipping into the trees like ghosts returning to the only world that had ever truly belonged to them. Long after their forms disappeared into the forest, I remained kneeling at the doorway, knees numb against the old wood, body unmoving, as if shifting would shatter what little was left of them in the air. The trees swallowed sound the way only deep snow and pine can. It wasn't silence, not really, but a kind of fullness, like the world had closed over their trail on purpose, protecting them from even my memory. I couldn't follow. That was the part I hadn't understood before. You don't just let go, you stay behind. The moment they crossed that line, they took something with them I would never get back. Not because they meant to, but because every living thing that asks for help and then chooses freedom rewrites the one who offered it. Inside, the fire was dying. I didn't stoke it, I didn't move. I let the cold creep in the way regret does, slow at first, then all at once. Not regret for the decision. Regret for how much I'd allowed myself to hope that maybe somehow they might stay. That I could build a life with wild things and it would be enough. That I could love something and not lose it. Foolish thoughts, but comforting, like a wool blanket you wrap around your shoulders, even though it smells like old smoke and memory. I had built this place to escape the world, and in doing so had created a vacuum that the world inevitably found. Not with noise, not with force, but with 3 pairs of tiny paws, a mother's haunted eyes, and a storm that forced us all to make contact. Marlene called that night. I let it ring. I didn't want to say the words out loud. Saying them would make it final, would strip away the magic and leave only fact. They're gone. I did the right thing. They might live now, might even thrive, but none of those phrases held weight in the empty spaces of the cabin. The couch looked wrong without Flint. The worn blanket near the fire was too still without Ash sprawled across it. The window seat felt hollow where Elsa used to perch like a queen guarding her borderlands. And the rug still held a tuft of Snow's fur, pale and soft, caught in the weave like a ghost that hadn't yet decided to leave. I slept in the chair that night, the same one I'd sat in the moment they arrived, and dreamt not of snow or wind, not of survival or storms, but of a slow movement in the trees, a glimpse of yellow eyes watching from a distance, just far enough to remain unknown, just close enough to never be forgotten. And when I woke, hand pressed to my chest like it could keep something from slipping out, I realized I had not rescued them. I had simply opened the door, and they had chosen to walk through it. The days that followed stretched out like the snowdrifts beyond the cabin, unchanging on the surface, but hiding a depth I hadn't yet learned how to measure. Without the bobcats, the silence returned, but it was different now. Before, it had been a silence of absence, of isolation and control, a quiet I'd once craved because it never asked anything from me. But now, the silence felt alive. It echoed in the floorboards where paws once pattered, hummed in the soft groan of the chair where I'd nursed Snow back from the edge. It moved through the cabin not as emptiness, but as memory, as presence, haunting but not painful. Marlene checked in again, her voice a thread across the distance. I answered this time. We spoke about logistics, vet reports, rewilding guidelines, what Callum might need to file to keep things off the books. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the pause she left in the conversation, the space where she let me grieve without naming it. They might come back, she said once, gently, without hope or expectation. Or they might not. Doesn't make it any less real. I think that's the part I needed to hear. That what happened here mattered, not because of how it ended, but because of how it changed us while it was happening. Rescue isn't about control. It's not about fixing or saving or even keeping. It's about witnessing, about standing at the edge of something broken and saying, I see you. I'll stay until you can stand again. Outside, the snow is beginning to recede in patches, revealing old trails, deer scat, claw marks on bark. Life goes on here with or without us, reshaping itself around storm and thaw. I sometimes imagine I see Elsa's tracks, sharp and clean, threading across the frozen river or skirting the edge of the tree line. Maybe I do. Maybe it's just what I want to see, but I like to think she remembers. That on some level, deep beneath instinct and muscle memory, she carries the scent of firewood and cedar, the sound of human breath, not raised in fear, but in quiet offering. The cubs would be stronger now, hunting, learning, fighting their way into a life that belonged to them and no one else. I still keep the blanket by the fire, not because I expect them back, but because letting it go would feel like erasing a page from a story that saved me as much as I saved them. If you've listened this far, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've stood at the edge of something wild and chosen compassion over certainty. Maybe you've opened a door not knowing who or what might walk through it. And if you haven't yet, I hope you will, because sometimes the smallest act of trust can change everything. For them, for you, for the story you didn't know you were meant to tell. If this story moved you, even a little, I invite you to sit with it for a moment longer. Think about the wild things, whether animals, people, or pieces of yourself you've once tried to protect. What did you give? What did you lose? What did you become? If you've ever felt the weight of choosing compassion in a moment of uncertainty, then you already know how powerful those quiet acts can be. And if this story made you feel something, seen, shaken, hopeful, please consider sharing it. Someone out there might need to hear that it's okay to open a door and okay to let go. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. I'll be here, telling them not because they're easy, but because they matter. And if nothing else, take this with you. Sometimes, just choosing to care is the most extraordinary thing we'll ever do.